Okay, friends, so here are the percentages I got for E and F. 43% of people back in spring 2021 would be extremely likely to take an in-person class the following term. And they asked people the next term, fall 2021, and that number had dropped to 31%. But remember, it only dropped in the sample. They didn't ask everybody. That means these numbers have a margin of error on them. Since they didn't ask everybody, even if the sample was representative, they'd still be off, most likely. And the margin around these numbers is 5%. That means that the spring 2021 numbers, when adjusted for the margin, you shouldn't say that 43% would be would be extremely likely to take an in-person class next term. You should say that between, and then we have to add and subtract 5% from that 43. So if I take 5% away, it's going to drop to 38. And if I add 5% to that, it goes up to 48. So, in other words, in spring 2021, the best we can do statistically, assuming that this number was gotten fairly, the best we can do statistically is say we are statistically confident that between 38% and 48% of students are extremely likely to take an in-person class the following term. If we do the same thing with the fall 2021 students, the best we can say is between, and if I use that 31% and use the same 5%, subtract and add, if I drop 5% here, it's going to be 26%. And if I add 5%, it's going to be 36%. Now, how can we say statistically that these two ranges of values imply that, yes, fewer students now want face-to-face classes than they did the previous term? Okay, now remember, this is all based on the fact that this sample was done well. And we're going to see later on why it probably wasn't. But assuming that the sample was done well, take a look at the numbers. You don't know what the actual percentages of people who are extremely likely to take an in-person class are. The only way to get that would be to ask every single student. They did not. Well, actually, they did. They sent emails to every single student, but most people didn't reply. But the only way we could know with certainty is if every single student gave their opinion. Here's the best we can do statistically. With the margin of error of 5% added and subtracted to these, we can statistically safely conclude that whatever the true population percentage is in between these numbers for spring 2021 and in between these numbers for fall of 2021. And here's the kicker. The kicker is that these two intervals do not overlap each other. In other words, even if this one is at the lowest possible end at 38%, and this one is at the highest at 36%, they don't touch each other. You know what? It might be easier to see this if we look at it graphically. Let's take a look at that now. Okay, my friends. Wardrobe change, because I started this video yesterday and I'm finishing it today because it's been that kind of a week. Okay. Exactly the same information here that we had 30 seconds ago, except now it's more graphical. I've placed the spring 2021 results here. This was the first of the two surveys. When folks were asked, how likely are you to take an in-person class the next term? We got a p-hat or statistic value of 43%. But you have to use that 5% margin of error, which is why this goes from about 38% to 48%. Remember, you can't report that a sample statistic is exactly equal to the population parameter that it stands for. I mean, you can say that, you just shouldn't say that, because it probably isn't. Even if the sample's done correctly, we'll talk about that later. But even if the sample's done correctly, it's probably going to be off a little bit. We've seen this in class multiple times and in videos multiple times. So a statistician will say, in spring 2021, I'm reasonably confident that between 38 and 48% of people will take an in-person class next term. The next term, the same statistician doing the repeated study would say, I'm reasonably confident that between 26 and 36% of people are going to be extremely likely to take an in-person class next term. Now, I'm very excited about these two intervals because they don't overlap each other. In other words, all the numbers in this interval are lower than all the numbers in this interval. Now, when I say all the numbers, what do I mean all the numbers? Take a step back. Let's talk about what those intervals are likely catching. Statisticians, although we can't actually get population parameters, are still interested in their values. That's why we do statistics. We want to know what all COCC students think, but we're only able to get a couple hundred responses. So the results we get from our study, this interval of values, is where a statistician believes the true value in the population to likely be. Here's the way I've visualized this over the years, and it helps me. I visualize the true parameter that we're looking for as a fish, and the interval that we construct as the aquarium that the fish is likely in. So imagine, if you will, the true population parameter of COCC students that are extremely likely to take an in-person course as the fish in that tank. And we don't know exactly where that fish is, but we know it's likely between the left and right sides of the tank. I only say it's likely because there's a chance we're completely wrong. The fish might not be in the tank at all. Might be outside the tank, might be dead on the... Let's not talk about that. That's kind of depressing. Statistically, if I've done my sample correctly and if I've crunched the numbers correctly, I'm statistically confident the fish is in the tank. Do I know exactly where? No, that fish is going back and forth in the tank. Same as this one. This is a different tank and maybe a different fish. How can we tell if it's likely a different fish? Well, if the tanks don't touch each other, then there's no way that this fish in this tank, even if it gets all the way to this side, it's still going to be lower percentage-wise than a fish in this tank that gets all the way to this side. Even if this one's as low as possible, it's still a little bit higher than this one that's as high as possible. According to my math, that's about at least a 2% difference. Is that meaningful? That's not for you and I to decide. As statisticians, we just create these two intervals and say, look, it looks like in-person desire has dropped in the extremely likely category. Because here, it's at least 38%, and here it's at most 36%. That tells us that there was a drop. There is a difference. I'm going to have you do the exact same thing next for online classes.